we're going to take what we did in the opener there. We're going to write down how we do each one of those operations on fractions. So how we add and subtract fractions, how we multiply fractions, how we divide fractions. We're going to put them all in one place. All right, so those are all going to go in our notes here. And then if you're doing something with fractions and you forget what to do, guess what you get to do with your notes?
Use them for the test.
Use them. You can use them for quizzes, you can use them for tests, you can use them for anything we're doing in here. All right, so anytime you're doing anything with fractions and you forget how to add them or forget how to multiply them or forget how to divide them, you can pull these notes out and use them. All right, so we're going to have them all in one place. We're going to start with adding and subtracting fractions. First thing I want to say about this is we have adding and subtracting fractions together because they're really the same thing. Subtraction is the same thing as adding a negative. All right, so just like when we were adding and subtracting integers, we have those rules that say if we have two positive numbers, well, let's go through those rules real quick. When we have two positive integers, do we add them or subtract them? We add them, and the answer is going to be positive. If we have a positive and a negative, what do? Subtract, and how do we know what the sign of the answer is going to be? Yeah, it's the same as the sign of the bigger number. So if the bigger number is negative, then the answer is negative. If the bigger number is positive, then the answer is positive. What if they're both negative numbers? Are we going to add or subtract? When they're both negative, we add, and the answer is going to be negative. Remember, if we're adding a bunch of negative chips to a bunch of negative chips, we're going to have a bunch more negative chips. Okay, so we add them together, and the answer is going to be negative. All right, so same thing's going to happen with fractions. Adding and subtracting are the same thing, just with some rule modifications with positives and negatives. All right, so the first thing we need to do when we're adding or subtracting is change one or both of the fractions so they have a what? Common denominator. So the first thing we need to do is get a common denominator. We won't always have to do this. If you think about the opener today, we only needed to get a common denominator for one of the problems. Okay, the very first problem we did not need a common denominator because we already had one. All right, then the second step says add or subtract blank according to their signs. This is where we use those rules for adding and subtracting integers. So which part are we going to add or subtract? Is it going to be the numerator or the denominator? The numerator. So we're going to add or subtract the numerator according to their signs. Meaning if they're both positive, we add. If they're both negative, we add, but then the answer is negative. If one's negative, one's positive, we subtract and use the sign of the bigger number. Okay, step 3 says we're going to keep something the same. What stays the same? So we add or subtract the numerator. The denominator stays the same. And then anytime we're working with fractions and we get a fraction for our answer, this is the last thing we're going to do. We're going to check to make sure that we can't do what? Simplify. Or some people like to say reduce the fraction. I like to use simplify, but they all mean the same thing. Okay, so the last thing we're going to do, if we can, is simplify. And so here's our first example. We have 2/5 plus 1/5. Now, this is a pretty easy one, but let's go through the steps and just make sure that we understand what each step means. The first step says change one or both of the fractions to get a common denominator. Do we need to do that step here? Why not? Yeah, they already have a common denominator. The 5's the same in both of them, so we don't need to do that step. All right, so we move on to the second step. Second step says add or subtract the numerators according to their signs. All right, so is the 2 positive or negative? Is the 1 positive or negative? Okay, so they're both positive. Does that mean we add or subtract? We add. What's 2 plus 1? 3. Okay, so that's step 2. Step 3. This one's easy. Keep the denominator the same. Well, what's the denominator going to be? So the denominator is going to be 5 because it stays the same. If these were not the same, then we wouldn't be able to do this step. All right, the last step says what? Simplify. Can we simplify this? No, why not? It's not because they're odd. It doesn't have anything to do with them being odd. Is there anything that goes into 3 that also goes into 5? No. Now, since they are odd, we know that 2 doesn't go into them, but we don't know if something else might go into them. The only numbers that go into 3 would be 1 and 3. The only numbers that go into 5 would be 1 and 5. Doesn't make sense to use the 1 because it's not going to change anything, so it's going to be 3/5. Don't forget to box your answers. Okay. One other thing that you'll want to do with fractions, I know a lot of you like to write fractions like this. I want you to get out of the habit of doing that because when you do that, it's hard to see what the numerator and the denominator are when we start putting other stuff in there. Okay, if I wrote this problem, let's say I wrote this problem like this, 2/5 plus 1/5, it's hard to tell what's going on here. It's hard to tell if we're supposed to add the 5 and the 1 together. So when you write it like this with the numerator over the denominator, it's a lot easier to read. Okay, next one. 2/3 plus 1/4. First step says change one or both of the fractions to get a common denominator. Do we need to do that step here? Yes, we didn't on the last one because we already had a common denominator. But on this one, we do have to do that because the denominators are different. If we don't do it, then when we get to the third step, we won't be able to keep the denominator the same. All right, so what is the common denominator going to be here? What number does 3 go into that 4 also goes into? 12. So now we need to figure out how we get that. So we're going to change these fractions. So I've got my 2 fractions here that I'm adding together. And I want to change this 3 into a 12. So I'm going to go ahead and just put a 12 here on the bottom. And I want to change this 4 into a 12. So I'm going to put a 12 on the bottom here. Now I'm going to figure out what do I do to get that 12. What do I multiply by 3 here to get 12? 4. So what do I have to do to the numerator? What do I have to do to the numerator? We need to multiply it by 4. Whatever we do on the denominator, we have to do the same thing on the numerator. Otherwise, we're going to be changing the value of that fraction. All right, so we multiply the top by 4 also. All right, what is 2 times 4? 8. So we get 8 in the numerator. In the second fraction, what do I multiply by 4 to make that into a 12? I've got to multiply by 3. So what do I have to do to the numerator? Multiply by 3. Whatever we did on the bottom, we have to do on top. Okay, so we multiply by 3 in the denominator, we multiply by 3 in the numerator. What is 1 times 3? 3. So we're going to have the 3 on top. Okay, so that's the first step. The first step's the trickiest one. Once we do that, though, it's pretty easy. The second step says we add or subtract the numerators according to their signs. Well, they're both positive, right? Right? The 8's positive, 3's positive, so do we add or subtract? Add. What's 8 plus 3? 11. And then the third step says we keep the denominators the same. So what's that going to be?
12.
And can we simplify that? No. There's nothing that goes into 11 that also goes into 12. Okay, next example. So this one's different because why? Yeah, we've got a whole number here. Anytime we're doing an operation with fractions, adding, subtracting, multiplying, dividing, we want both of the numbers to be fractions. So what can I do to make both of these numbers fractions? Ian? Yeah, we're going to put a 1 underneath the 3. So 3 is the same thing as 3 over 1. And by doing that, now we have a numerator and a denominator in that first term that we can work with. All right, so we'll make that number into a fraction. It is an improper fraction. We'll talk in a minute about improper fractions. But let's go ahead and go through those steps now. So step 1 says we need to change one or both of them to get a common denominator. What's our common denominator going to be here? 12. All right, so I want to get 12 in the denominator of both of these fractions. And so what do I multiply by 1 to get 12? Multiply by 12. So that's going to give me the 12 here. What do I get? What am I going to get on top here? How do I get it? Multiply by 12 on top. What's 3 times 12? 36. Okay, how about the second fraction? What do I need to do to this fraction? Do I need to multiply by 1? No, it already has a 12 in the denominator. So I don't need to worry about multiplying by anything to get a different fraction. I'm going to keep the fraction the same. It's just going to be 1/12, just like we started with. All right, now the next step says that we're going to add or subtract the numerators according to their signs. So is this 36 here positive or negative? It's positive. Is the 1 here positive or negative? It's negative. Why? Yeah, we're subtracting it. The subtraction, remember, means that this number here is negative. It actually only means that the 1 is negative. The 12 is not negative. So what we have here is a positive 36 and a negative 1. Since 1's positive, 1's negative, are we going to add or subtract? We're going to subtract. What's 36 minus 1? 35. And on the bottom, what are we going to do with the denominators? Keep them the same, right? Denominator stays the same when we add and subtract. Now, the next question is, can I simplify? Is there anything that goes into 35 that also goes into 12? No. The numbers that go into 35 would be 5, 7, and 35. And 5 and 7 and 35, none of those go into 12, so we can't simplify that. Now, my next question is, well, what kind of fraction is this? It's an improper fraction. Why? The numerator is bigger than the denominator. It's okay to have an improper fraction. In fact, it's better when we're doing the operations on fractions to have an improper fraction than it is to have a mixed number. Because if we have a number like 2 and 11/12, you don't need to write that down. But if we had something like this, it would be really hard to work with. It's difficult to multiply mixed numbers, it's difficult to divide, it's difficult to add and subtract. So rather than changing it to a mixed number that's difficult to work with, we're just going to leave it as an improper fraction that's easier to work with. Okay? So don't worry about mixed numbers. Okay, last one. We're actually going to do this one 2 different ways. I want you to try to do it on your own for a second here first. First step, we need to get a common denominator. And like I said, I'm going to do this one 2 different ways. So let's get a common denominator here an easy way first. The easiest way to get a common denominator is to do what with 8 and 6? It's not necessarily the best way, but it's the easiest way. We can just multiply them together. Okay? If I just take the 8 times the 6, that's going to give me a common denominator. And the problem is going to work that way. Now, I'm not saying this is the best way to do it. This is actually not the way I would do it. But it's a good way to do it still. It's still going to work. Okay? So if we do the 8 times 6, we get 48. And so let's use 48 as our common denominator. What do I multiply by 8 here to get 48? Okay? So if I'm going to do it this way, I'm going to multiply this by 6, which means I need to multiply the 3 by 6 and get what? 18. Okay? And then what do I multiply by 6 to get 48? 8, so I multiply by 8 here, which means I multiply by 8 here and get 40. Alright, so then the next step, we're going to add or subtract the numerators. Are we going to add or subtract here? Subtract. Okay, we have a positive 18 and a negative 40. So what is 40 minus 18? Anybody know? 22. And is that going to be a positive 22 or a negative 22? Negative. Why? Because the 40 is bigger. Okay, good. What's the denominator going to be? 48. Now the last step says we need to simplify. Can I simplify this? Yes. What number goes into 22 that also goes into 48? 2. If they're both even, then you know 2 goes into it. Alright, so what's 22 divided by 2? 11, and since that was a negative 22, it's going to be a negative 11, right? What's 48 divided by 2? and that doesn't simplify, so that's your answer. All right, now, like I said, that's one way to do it, and that is the correct answer. There's a different way to do it, though. All right, what we found here is a common denominator, but it's not the least common denominator. You guys heard that term, least common denominator? Okay, what's the least common denominator here? 24. So we got that denominator by multiplying the 8 times the 6, but there's a smaller number that both of those go into. Okay, 8 goes into 24 and 6 also goes into 24. So we can use 24 as a common denominator also. So let's see what happens when we do that. It's going to look a little bit different. What do I multiply by 8 to get 24? 3. So I multiply 3 times 3 here and get 9. What do I multiply by 6 to get 24? 4. So I multiply the numerator by 4 and get 'Alright, so now we have our common denominator. Now we'll subtract. We have a positive 9 and a negative 20. So we take the bigger minus the smaller. 20 minus 9 is 11. Is that going to be a positive 11 or a negative 11? Negative. And then what do we do with the denominator? Keep it the same. Can I reduce that?
No.
No. So that's my answer. Is that the same thing I got the other way? Yes. Okay. You can use any number as your common denominator that 8 and 6 both go into, and you'll get the right answer. You just have to make sure that you do all your math correct and you simplify in the end. You could use a number like 480 as a common denominator, and it will work. It's just going to be a lot more work than you need. Okay? So there's two different ways to do it. You can use a least common denominator, or you can just multiply the denominators together to get your common denominator, and either way will work.